Would you like to understand what the short-term downsides of consciousness can be? Then listen to this entire video where I first explain the symbolism behind consciousness, which is the important sort of prerequisite before you can understand what the downside of consciousness can be. This is my part one of this series, and I will make the second video where I go more into the practical manifestations or downsides of consciousness. So before we start, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. Let's get into it. Now, I am personally a strong advocate of consciousness. I think it is a net value creating endeavor. So that means on average the benefits do outweigh the downsides. However, there are sort of downsides, seemingly downsides in the short term. But like, for example, you could compare it to suffering. Most suffering makes you grow. So is suffering really... It's not obviously bad if it makes you grow. So would the downsides of consciousness really be downsides or just simply a stepping stone? That's up for debate, but let's get into it. To map out sort of the pros and cons, but mainly the cons of consciousness, I'll first sort of talk about the outcomes. So what's the end product of consciousness? And that is consciousness lets you take a progressive step towards wholeness. Now, you could equate wholeness with enlightenment, which is the absence of suffering. It is something like perfection, and imperfection is suffering. We are imperfect, we are quite limited, and that makes us suffer. Like, that's the causal reason for suffering, because we're quite limited. We have limited brain capacity, our bodies are limited, we can get ill, we can get sick. And sort of wholeness, sort of the final step of consciousness, you could also use as a synonym for God. Now, I don't want to add religious like a connotation to that, but it is the symbol of God. It is sort of everything. It is complete perfection. That's what it symbols. Like, there is sort of God within you, this perfection for potential within you, but you need to first become conscious before you can get there, let's say. So obviously, this outcome of consciousness sounds super attractive, but here's the catch. Well, first of all, like I just said, these effects sound very attractive, and it sounds like you sort of ascend into the heavens when you are conscious. It seems like consciousness is an upwards journey, going upwards all the time. But here's the catch. Here's the downsides. Every ascension is preceded by a descent. You first need to descend into the darkness before you can rise into the heights. And this is why consciousness is in relative short supply. Because before you can reach it, you need to do some uncomfortable reflections, let's say. Now, Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, sort of symbolizes this tendency, this dynamic of descending before you can ascend, with a dream which he heard of from a theologian. And I think the dream, this is a quote I'm about to say, is as followings. So the guy dreaming, so he saw on a mountain a kind of castle of the Grail. I assume that is referring to the Holy Grail. So the most valuable thing, consciousness maybe. He went along a road that seemed to lead straight to the foot of the mountain and up it. So the mountain where the castle, the Holy Grail is. But as he drew nearer, he discovered to his great disappointment that a chasm separated him from the mountain, a deep, darksome gorge with underworldly water rushing along the bottom. A steep path led downwards, and toilsomely climbed up again on the other side. But the prospects looked inviting, and the dreamer awoke. So here, this dreamer sees this most valuable thing, consciousness, or perfection, on the other side, at the top of the mountain. And as he comes closer, he realizes the path to the mountain is inhibited by a descent into darkness, into this sort of, this ravine, this chasm, this abyss, where there is water at the bottom, and only afterwards does the path go back up again. And that's very uninviting, quite a dark sort of, it makes you feel uncomfortable. So here the dreamer, this is another quote, was thirsting for shiny heights, but he first had to descend into the dark depths, and this proves to be an indispensable condition for climbing any higher. The prudent man avoids the danger lurking in these depths, but he also throws away the good which a bold but imprudent venture might bring. So you need to accept that and face the fact that an ascension is preceded by a descent, and that's quite dark. And what's also very interesting here is that water is very often symbolized in dreams as the unconscious mind. It's your instincts, it's your archetypes. And water in this dream was at the bottom of the abyss, of the chasm. So it symbolizes that he first needs to dive into his unconscious before he can rise. And that is what Carl Jung stated to be the process in order to reach perfection. That is to integrate the contents of your unconscious mind into your conscious mind in order to become a whole person. That is the journey of consciousness. And people tend to think that consciousness mainly entails being aware of your surroundings. And although consciousness does entail observing your environment, the majority of consciousness lies within introspection. It's looking at yourself. And consciousness is about facing what is darkest. And the darkest spaces do not lie outside of yourself, but within yourself. You literally have an abyss lying within you, which does not seem to have a visible ending or bottom to it. It's just this dark hole. And I like to think humans as such, they are sort of walking holes, walking abysses, if that's the plural word. There's this sort of, this unawareness of what lies within them. They're so complex, humans. They're so almost seemingly potentially infinitely complex, and that's quite scary, but at the same time it means they have the potential, they have almost seemingly infinite potential within them, and that is divine. So the downside of consciousness entails first descending into your dark unconscious mind, which is very frightening, and that is sort of the first step of, for example, facing your shadow. Now, in part 2 of this video, I will discuss more of the practical downsides of consciousness, sort of things to do with your ego, not in the Jungian term, the ego, but more of just like your arrogance, your ego, your persona, like your sort of the image you have of yourself. And as I said again, these are mainly only downsides, I think, in the short term if you face them. But like most suffering, as I said, it makes you grow. So are these things even downsides? That's the question. But this was just, I needed to map out the symbolism of consciousness before we can get into the practical stuff so we know what it really entails. So please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for listening.